For almost 30 years, Final Fantasy has been one of the world's most popular gaming franchises. From its humble beginnings on the Nintendo Entertainment System to the worldwide hit of Final Fantasy VII to today, where the series is enjoying continued popularity with a successful MMO, multiple mobile games, and the most recent mainline entry, Final Fantasy XV. But it wasn't easy to reach this point. For Square Enix, the publisher and developer of many of the Final Fantasy titles, developing the 15th entry of the franchise included many roadblocks and an elongated development that lasted over 10 years. Everything has a story. This is the story of Final Fantasy XV. In this series, we'll be taking a look at the long development of 15, the release of the final product, and a peek at where the Final Fantasy franchise is today. 2006 marked a turning point in the world of video games. A new generation of home consoles were making their way onto store shelves, and developers were salivating at the prospects of developing games for the first high-definition game consoles. Square Enix was one of these ambitious developers who looked to recreate the success they saw on the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 for these upcoming systems. Square Enix was shaken up by recent developments within the company. 5 years earlier, Squaresoft released Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, an animated feature film that flopped at the box office, putting the company's future in jeopardy. Thanks to successful game releases like Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts, and a merger with former rival Enix, they bounced back, but at a cost. Final Fantasy creator Hironobu Sakaguchi left Square Enix in 2004, leaving the company without one of its most prominent faces and creative minds. This created an opportunity for a new generation of developers to step up in an attempt to fill the role Sakaguchi left behind. The 12th entry in the Final Fantasy series hit Japanese shores in March of 2006, with an international release planned for the fall on the PlayStation 2. This didn't stop Square Enix from showing off the future of the franchise at E3 2006. 3 new titles were announced for Sony's PlayStation 3 and mobile phones at the event, under the banner Fabula Nova Crystallis. Translated from Latin, the title means the new tale of the crystal. The new subseries would share a common mythos, though the characters and scenarios would remain unconnected. The first of these games revealed was Final Fantasy XIII, with a sleek trailer showing off a new heroine and stylish combat. Next up was Final Fantasy Agito 13, an ambitious new title for mobile phones, although it would eventually be announced for the PlayStation Portable as well. The final title announced was Final Fantasy Versus XIII, another PlayStation 3 exclusive. Accompanied by a CGI trailer, this spin-off was being directed by Tetsuya Nomura, the creator and director of the Kingdom Hearts franchise. Square Enix's first production department was handling development of the title, after finishing up Kingdom Hearts 2 a year earlier. The new game featured a spiky-haired protagonist with multiple crystal-like weapons, cutting down enemy soldiers. Versus 13 took a darker turn compared to past Final Fantasy games, with characters clad in black and enemies spilling blood when pierced by the protagonist's blade. Nomura stated that the title was chosen as a mirror to Final Fantasy XIII due to this darker theming. This new Final Fantasy featured an interesting tagline: fantasy based on reality. It promised to be a very different take on Final Fantasy. At the time of its announcement, Versus 13 was very early in production. Development started in early 2006, and the reveal trailer served more as a concept than a showcase of the final product. News on the game was quiet for a year and a half. It was finally shown again at a Square Enix fan event, but it was simply an updated version of the trailer shown at E3 2006. Internally, developers were working on various ideas, and Versus 13 was growing to be more than a simple spin-off. Some developers even proposed to make Versus 13 into a mainline Final Fantasy entry. Development of Versus 13 began to slow down during 2008. Final Fantasy XIII was taking more time than anticipated. Staff restructuring led to many of the developers of Versus 13 to be pulled onto the Final Fantasy XIII team. Square Enix insisted that development of Versus 13 had not been halted, but a lack of updates left fans worried. The term vaporware, a piece of hardware or software that was officially announced but never cancelled or released, began to be associated with Versus 13, due to the lack of updates on the project. Final Fantasy Versus XIII wouldn't be shown at E3 2008, but a bombshell announcement about Final Fantasy XIII rocked the gaming world. During Microsoft's press conference that year, Final Fantasy XIII was announced for the Xbox 360. While 13 wouldn't be the first Final Fantasy for Microsoft systems, it would be the first time Final Fantasy would release on multiple consoles at the same time. It also marked the end of Sony's exclusivity of single-player Final Fantasy titles, since the series jumped to the platform in the mid-90s. Versus 13, however, would remain a PlayStation 3 exclusive. Versus 13 exhibited signs of life in late 2008, when new details of the game were finally revealed. A new 5-minute trailer shown at Jump Festa 2008 gave more information on Versus 13 than ever before. A new female adversary, 3 new supporting characters, ominous men in dark suits, ruined cityscapes and open roads, all highlighted by staff credits for the talent working on the game. The trailer still featured many scenes from the initial reveal trailer, and no gameplay was shown, but many exhaled a sigh of relief. Despite the setbacks, Versus 13 was still alive. The next look at Final Fantasy Versus XIII happened at the Tokyo Game Show in 2009. In a closed theater demonstration, Square Enix showcased actual gameplay of Versus 13. The demo had our protagonist, then named Noxus, walking around various environments. The demo did little to impress audiences, but at the very least it showed that progress was being made on the title. While 2010 was a big year for Final Fantasy, it was relatively quiet on news for Versus 13. After launching in Japan in late 2009, Final Fantasy XIII released worldwide on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 in March. Despite being met with lukewarm reviews, 13 was a commercial success after being in development for over 5 years. Versus 13, on the other hand, was still in pre-production. In August, Nomura stated that the game's scenario had been finalized and that voice casting was underway. Attempting to set expectations for fans, Square Enix commented that the game probably wouldn't be out by the end of 2011. Final Fantasy Versus XIII was shown for a final time at the Square Enix first production department premiere in January of 2011. The event announced multiple titles from Square Enix. Alongside reveals of Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Kingdom Hearts 3D, Final Fantasy Agato 13 was renamed to Final Fantasy Type O and given a summer 2011 release in Japan. Versus 13 received a new trailer featuring full voice acting and actual gameplay. The 7-minute long trailer delivered more story details, impressive set pieces, and combat heavily inspired by the Kingdom Hearts series. No release date was given for the ambitious project, but fans had renewed hope. Versus 13 was in full development, and a release was just around the corner. However, a new challenge arose for the development team that would set the title back years. In mid-2011, a new generation of gaming began. Nintendo announced a successor to their Wii console and had released a new handheld, the 3DS, earlier that year. Sony was preparing to launch the PlayStation Vita, and both Sony and Microsoft began showing new hardware prototypes to developers around this time. PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 would be irrelevant in due time. This put Versus 13 in serious peril. As a PlayStation 3 exclusive launching after the release of more powerful and popular hardware, it would certainly spell doom for the title with an ever-growing budget. A change was needed, and Square Enix staff began a massive shift in production in 2011 and 2012. Despite being in some form of development for 5 years, the title was nowhere near complete, with some developers estimating that the game was only about 20 to 25% done. The first change was the development engine, a toolset used by game designers to make their games. Versus 13 was being developed with Square Enix's Crystal Tools engine. Crystal Tools was a powerful engine at the time, but had caused numerous problems in development, with some attributing Final Fantasy XIII's long development to the engine's issues. Nomura announced in September of 2011 that Versus 13 was shifting development to a new engine, known as LUMINOUS Studio, a more powerful engine capable of handling the demands of a new generation of game systems. The staff of Versus 13 was also restructured. After the release of Final Fantasy Type O, many of the members of the game's development team joined the staff of Versus 13. Type O's director, Hajime Tabata, joined the staff as co-director of Versus 13, alongside Nomura. Versus 13 changed the platform it would release on. No longer a PlayStation 3 exclusive, the game would launch on both the upcoming PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. After years of discussion, the title would see one final change during the restructuring. Versus 13 was no longer a spin-off. Its development would be rebooted from the ground up as the 15th mainline Final Fantasy game. This was the best possible result for Versus 13. Executives at Square Enix were unhappy with the game's long development time, with some wanting to cancel the game outright in an attempt to protect the Final Fantasy brand. Part of this reasoning came from Final Fantasy XIV, an MMO released on PC in 2010. Upon release, the game was a massive flop, and Square opted to pour resources into saving the title rather than abandon the player base. This came on top of long development times for various other Final Fantasy projects, including Final Fantasy XIII and Type O. Saving Versus 13 did come at a cost to the staff of the title, as many of the developers were sent to other development teams during the staff restructuring. Rumors of the restructuring wouldn't remain a secret for long. With the game out of the public's eye for over a year, rumors began cropping up from various media outlets in mid-2012 that Versus 13 had become Final Fantasy 15, with development being pushed to the next generation of consoles. Other rumors stated that the game had been cancelled outright. Square remained silent on the rumors. It wouldn't be until February 2013 when Shinji Hashimoto, the brand director of Final Fantasy, made an announcement during Sony's PlayStation 4 reveal event. No gameplay or trailers were shown. Not even a title screen was seen in the auditorium. Hashimoto simply stated that a new Final Fantasy game was being made for the PlayStation 4, and that Square Enix would have more details at E3 2013. The world is ever changing. At E3 2013, Final Fantasy Versus XIII was seen publicly for the first time in over 2 years. A new trailer dropped in the middle of Sony's legendary press conference announcing the title for the company's upcoming PlayStation 4. The game was notably different from past iterations. Many new characters joined the fray, with some old ones nowhere to be seen. The trailer showcased new story elements, a massive battle with Leviathan, a longtime series boss, and a reworked combat system. The most startling information for the trailer came at the end, when the game's logo shattered, only to be reformed with a new name, Final Fantasy XV. Thanks for watching the first part in a 2-part series on the story of Final Fantasy XV. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and share this video on your favorite social media sites. Subscribe to catch the next episode when it comes out next week, and leave a comment on what games, consoles, or events in gaming history you would like to see me cover next. In the next episode, we'll be taking a look at the second half of Final Fantasy XV's development and its worldwide release. And once again, thank you for watching.